Well, welcome everyone. I'm just gonna click on the notice that we're recording. Welcome everyone. I am Susan Stark. I'm the Director of Program for League of Women Voters of Denver. This is a virtual briefing entitled Human Trafficking in Colorado, Wage Theft, Religious Indoctrination, and Homelessness. For this briefing, we welcome Marianna Kosharovsky, founder and executive director of ALIGHT, a Colorado nonprofit that offers pro bono legal assistance to victims of human trafficking. The League of Women Voters of Denver's briefings, whether in person or virtual, are always open to the public as well as to our members at no charge. Tonight's briefing will be recorded, and it, as well as Marianna's PowerPoint slides, will be available on our website within about 2 days. The dual goals of program in the League are: one, to provide education, enabling citizens to fully participate in democracy, and two, to take action after thorough study of an issue using factual research, member discussion, and consensus. Such action was taken by the National Convention of the League of Women Voters of the U.S. in 2014, when they took the following position on human trafficking. The League of Women Voters opposes all forms of domestic and international human trafficking of adults and children, including sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We consider human trafficking to be a form of modern-day slavery and believe that every measure should be taken and every effort should be made through legislation and changes in public policy to prevent human trafficking. Prosecution and penalization of traffickers and abusers should be established, and existing laws should be strictly enforced. Extensive essential services for victims should be applied where needed. Education and awareness programs on human trafficking should be established in our communities and in our schools. When I contacted Marianna to ask her to do tonight's presentation, she responded in this way: human trafficking is a widely misunderstood topic. Many are surprised to learn that it takes many forms and takes place in over 25 industries. I would like to address some of the myths in the human trafficking field, how people are lured into trafficking, and different examples of human trafficking in our community. Further, I will cover how ALIGHT, and that is Marianna's not-for-profit, and it stands for Alliance to Lead Impact in Global Human Trafficking. So she will cover how ALIGHT empowers individuals through legal services who have been exploited on the basis of their vulnerabilities, such as experiences with homelessness, domestic violence, the foster care system, and religious indoctrination. Marianna Kosharovsky is the founder and executive director of ALIGHT, a nonprofit with a mission to empower human trafficking survivors at scale on their journey to true freedom. ALIGHT is one of the few organizations in the U.S. that provides comprehensive legal services specifically for children, women, and men who have experienced abuse and exploitation. Ms. Kosharovsky's expertise is rooted in over 15 years of experience in anti-trafficking law and collaboration with the U.S. and Eastern European countries and Russia. She is a contributing author of Lawyers as Changemakers through the American Bar Association in 2016. She holds a Juris Doctorate from NYU Law School. In 2021, Marianna was honored to be named as an inaugural member of Freedom Collaborative's Global Advisory Committee, a diverse group of new generation activists and anti-trafficking professionals from around the world. Please write your questions or comments in the chat. These will be monitored by Bobby Heisterkamp, and she will pose them to our speaker after the presentation. If there's time, we will also take questions verbally as well. You will be muted as soon as the speaker begins. And now I want to welcome Marianna.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you everyone for joining. I will start sharing my presentation. Hopefully you can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. Well, the title is intended to alert you to the fact that human trafficking is taking many forms. This crime, this social malady is, my argument, much more prevalent and closer to home than many realize. And so I hope to further your thinking on this issue and perhaps even surprise you with some of the delving into the myths around this so that we can truly understand this complicated, pervasive problem and start to address it. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today covering what is human trafficking, who is trafficked, why are people trafficked, where does it take place, and what help do these victims and survivors need, along with some next steps for what you can do and how you can get involved. So let's start with some myths. And some of these may be familiar to you, and some of them may be perhaps assumptions that you've been picking up because our public sphere, our media, our journalists, our film industry is often telling one story that's not the whole story of human trafficking. One myth is that human trafficking and sex trafficking are the same thing, and they're not synonymous. Human trafficking also includes labor trafficking, but yet the conversation and the focus, if you notice, often tends to be on sex trafficking. The danger there is if we only talk about one dimension, the sensationalized dimension, the more commonly portrayed dimension, then we're rendering a whole population of victims invisible because there is also a significant labor trafficking problem. There is the myth that human trafficking and human smuggling mean the same thing. I see this in headlines by very well-respected journalists all the time, the equating of human smuggling and human trafficking. And the term human trafficking has become very frustrating to me just because we have to spend so much time redefining it. When we see trafficking, I think we commonly think it has to do with movement. That's what this crime is really about. And so it makes sense that smuggling people across the border is what trafficking is about. In fact, the essence of trafficking, as you'll hear me say over and over and over again during this presentation, is exploitation, the profiting of someone's vulnerability. Human trafficking is about exploitation. It is not necessarily about movement. So human smuggling situations may lead to human trafficking because those individuals that are smuggled may be rendered vulnerable and isolated, and then the smugglers exploit that dynamic and profit from them, and then it becomes trafficking, but they are not necessarily always occurring together. There is a common myth that only children are victims of trafficking, and this is admittedly a very heartbreaking area of this crime. However, we have to remember that people of all ages are actually trafficked. A significant portion of adults are trafficked as well, and so we have to bring them back into the conversation to make sure that we're addressing their needs as well. There is the myth that only women and girls are victims of trafficking. So this one is a little tricky. Women and girls, according to reports, are disproportionately affected by trafficking. But we have to remember that boys and men are not immune from it. And so we have to keep bringing in individuals of all genders, of all ages, of all backgrounds, again, back into the conversation, into the public consciousness to realize how broad of a problem it is. It's not just children, it's not just women and girls, it's actually quite broader than that. There is a common myth that most victims in the US are foreign nationals. In fact, many don't even realize that trafficking is happening in this country. They imagine that it's happening, or they assume that it's happening in other places. Here I have an image of a very powerful photograph by the humanitarian photographer Lisa Christine, who in fact documents trafficking around the world. And here it's bricklayers in Nepal, and we've heard of stories in Thailand and everything like that. Well, we definitely know it's happening in the US, but it's also true that most victims in the US are actually domestic victims. So that ends up being a very surprising point. But as we continue our discussion today, as we dive into the definition of trafficking and as it relates to vulnerability and social inequality and all the drivers that render someone vulnerable to exploitation in the first place, we start to understand why it is such a domestic problem for us as well. There is a common narrative that most victims are trafficked or kidnapped by strangers. You know, we have for a number of years, a lot of us in the anti-trafficking field were talking about how the movie Taken is misrepresenting what trafficking really is. And now we see the movie The Sound of Freedom, and the idea that someone is being trafficked by a stranger, perhaps kidnapped in these very, very extreme environments, and you know, it takes a big guy with a big gun to solve this, is really a misleading picture. We'll dive into the profile of traffickers, but the bottom line is the majority of victims, as reports show, tend to be trafficked by someone that they know, and some may be kidnapped, but or taken by force, but that's actually not really the significant issue. As we return again to that definition of trafficking as the exploitation of someone's vulnerability, we realize it doesn't take a gun to someone's head. It doesn't take tying someone up. It doesn't take locking them in a room to make them, to exploit them and to keep them in that dynamic. There's so many other tools at the perpetrator's disposal that they use that they don't actually have to resort to this. The myth that real victims don't return to trafficking or to their trafficker can be really, really harmful. Perhaps it comes from people's idea that they're choosing to go back, and if someone is choosing the situation, that they can't be trafficked. But as we get to know survivors and their stories, we realize these are very complicated dynamics where if someone is being trafficked by someone they know, if they have been groomed and manipulated into certain situations, they may have an emotional tie, sometimes called trauma bonded to who their abuser is, and so have very complicated feelings about their relationship to them. And in some ways, they could be in very practical terms, bonded to their abuser because they don't have other options to survive. And so even if they escape and try to make their way, a number of barriers in their path, including legal barriers, as we'll talk about, can make their survival and reintegration into our society almost impossible. And so they have to return to survive. And so we have to remember that victims have very complicated relationships to their traffickers often. There's the myth that City X is a hotspot for human trafficking. And sometimes we talk about Denver as a hotspot for human trafficking as we look at certain dynamics that are here. We're the site of major interstate highway, international airport. There's a booming economy with a demand for cheap labor. So there's certainly a number of factors to see. But if we look at data very critically, we realize the data in the area of human trafficking is very, very problematic and hard to come by. And so we never really have a clear picture. As you can imagine, because human trafficking is a crime, the criminals are not self-reporting the extent of what they're doing. And their victims may not know that they're a victim of crime, or they may have barriers to reaching out for help or reporting the crime. They may not understand that they're a victim. They may be too ashamed to come forward. And so gathering a clear picture through data is very problematic. We're piecing together what we know, and we will talk about some of that data, but we have to remember we don't have a reliable or evidence-based source to really understand exactly where it's happening or not. We need to think about trafficking as a prevalent problem that's in fact taking place in numerous cities and regions and corridors. It's very hard to predict other than if we think about its relationship to vulnerability. I always use an example from our work in Colorado. We've had an issue come out of Baca County in Colorado. You know, it's something that perhaps one may not think of as happening in that location, but this is a problem that shows up all over the map. There's also the myth that during the Super Bowl or the Denver Stock Show, trafficking actually increases, specifically sex trafficking. And this is another data question, because we have to think about causality. You know, my argument, and as I want to impress upon you, is this is a prevalent problem that is a reflection of the vulnerability and the inequality in our society. And so where we look and where we look to try to outreach to this population, where we create resources to give them an incentive to come forward for help, we tend to find more survivors. The data dynamic around these large events is that there is a conversation that these events may draw more trafficking to them, which draws more resources and perhaps police investigations and surveillance and activity, where as they look harder, they can find more instances. And then it feeds the narrative that there have been so many cases found around these big events. However, we don't have a counterfactual. If in fact we are, again, investing resources into looking into this issue, we find these cases. So this is another moment of caution as you surely see these sort of things in the news. Finally, the myth that there are hundreds of legal organizations that are providing legal services to victims and survivors so that they can exit is certainly a myth, and that is a myth around which ALIGHT is specifically working. Human trafficking, as I want us to think about, is the exploitation, the profiting of someone's vulnerability through forced fraud or coercion for sex or labor. The federal definition and the Colorado state laws that have come in line with the federal definition look at the forced fraud and coercion as important elements to this crime. The really critical one for us to zero in on is the coercion, because as I mentioned, it's not necessary for someone to put a gun to someone's head to exploit them. If they're already dealing with someone in a vulnerable situation, they have so many other tools, such as threatening them, threatening their family members, making them dependent, using manipulation and abuse to ensnare them in those relationships. In the legal definitions, there's an exception for that element for minors. So for commercial sexual exploitation, it is not necessary to prove that the minor was even coerced into commercial sex. It is assumed if they are under 18. And so really the de facto 11th myth is whenever you see a news article, which I still see in this day and age, the term child prostitute does XYZ, that is impossible. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. A child cannot agree to be in prostitution under our laws. So that is the silent 11th myth to share with you. So trafficking is really a different term for all the social ills we already know. It is another word for homelessness, domestic violence, child abuse, wage theft, as I know this group has also weighed in on, observing social media scams, fake modeling offers, poverty, all those situations. But the hardest cases, it happens across the board in all these different situations where there's those added elements of that person's vulnerability being exploited through manipulation or fraud or one of those other means of coercion. So it's been I have to say it's been a problematic term because it seems like it's a different problem. A lot of times it's presented as this organization works on domestic violence, that organization works on homelessness, that organization works on human trafficking, when in fact, if we look at it critically, we start to see that there's so much overlap. And in fact, trafficking is, again, all of these situations, only the most extreme forms of those situations. And because they are the hardest cases, because they are the situations where the individual has been the most abused, they tend to be the most traumatized. And their cases are hard in the sense that bringing them back to stability, bringing them back to our society, reintegrating them, supporting their recovery is a long, long process, a long journey. It's not a quick fix. Again, it's not, you know, a big guy with a gun is not going to help someone be free when we understand that their freedom was initially a matter of their lack of options. And so we have to remember that with this population and the horrible, horrible sustained abuse that they have endured, we have to be there with them for the long haul because their journey forward is going to be long and complicated. It is about vulnerability. Our organization works strictly on the legal services for the various populations that experience exploitation, providing them with comprehensive legal services. We don't work on policy and legislation. And so I will not be speaking directly to that, but I will be encouraging this group, when you're thinking about policies and policy change, to keep connecting this issue to vulnerability and thinking about what has made someone susceptible to somebody else exploiting them in the first place. One interesting place to start is this project, The Life Story, which focused on the dynamics of what women and girls face of how they enter the so-called sex trade in the first place and the barriers they encounter to leaving the sex trade. They, as you could see on this, in the schematic, a lot of them have been born into inequality, have experienced child sexual abuse, have perhaps gone through the foster care system, had issues with school, and you could see how a lot of these issues build and build and build. And so in a way, their place in our society has rendered them vulnerable, not one single event or one single particular action by the trafficker. And then it also makes them more dependent on their trafficker. And so we want to think about trafficking as it relates to poverty, lack of other economic opportunities, social and economic inequality, and then the market demands. What are the market demands for commercial sex? What are the market demands for inexpensive products and services that are driving labor exploitation that leads to labor trafficking of individuals? That is all part of the picture and all part of this discussion. So as I said, the data is problematic, but I still find this, this map perhaps helpful to our discussion. Hopefully you could see on the, it's a little cut off on mine, but on the bottom and in the slides that will be provided, you'll see that this is a heat map of reported calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline in 2018. So this heat map is at least giving us a picture of the relative number of calls, while we know that it is so hard for us to get a grasp on the absolute number of calls, on the actual scale of this problem. Again, there are so many barriers to understanding the actual scale of this problem because it is not reported fully. So we have to understand that everything we see is just the tip of the iceberg. Compounded with that is the fact that, for example, these reports to the National Human Trafficking Hotline are different than reports to the Colorado State Human Trafficking Hotline. Some of those reports may overlap and some of them may be separate from those to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so a lot of times we're actually piecing together what we're getting and trying to get a picture of what we see. But again, at least the heat map shows us the relative the relative intensity of calls from different parts of the country, and they're coming from all different, of course, all different locations. The bottom line is always is that it's, even if we don't know the complete picture, we do know that it is prevalent. The National Human Trafficking Hotline's statistics for Colorado, again, are a starting point for a conversation. We're seeing what venues of trafficking, what industries have been reported. We see that in sex trafficking, they've been reported in pornography, illicit massage, in spa businesses, residence-based commercial sex, hotel and motel-based escort and delivery service contexts. And then in the labor trafficking reports, they've been reported in the hospitality industry and the domestic work industry. I have to tell you that from our work with ALIGHT, as we track what industries are being reported, it is much broader than that. But again, this is a starting point for our conversation based on the National Human Trafficking Hotline numbers. I do want to share that the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline, CONEHT, C-O-N-E-H-T, is also, it's a big presence in Colorado where people call in for reports, survivors call in for resources, and they have been reporting year over year increase in the number of reports. Again, looking at data critically, we're not sure what it means because there has been more awareness of human trafficking, more conversations around trafficking. Colorado specifically has been investing in significant public awareness campaigns to help people understand that it's taking place locally, to encourage people to report. And so we assume that that's also driving awareness, just as this presentation with the resources at the end is hopefully driving awareness. So we are seeing reports increase year over year. We know that the reports are just the tip of the iceberg, and we try to do the best that we can with this data. An important data point for us is that we know trafficking is taking place across so many different industries, so many more industries than people realize, from construction to arts and entertainment to illicit massage parlors and other examples that are perhaps more common in our public conversation. But this is a great resource that goes into 25 of the industries and specific dynamics. ALIGHT, for this year, ALIGHT also did a social media campaign diving into these industries to help unearth some of the dynamics and start conversations for the public about how close to home this issue really is. This year's theme for World Day Against Trafficking, every year on July 30th, there is an international coordinated effort to draw awareness on trafficking and a different theme every year. This year's theme was Reach Every Survivor. And so ALIGHT's part of that campaign was to talk about reaching every survivor across the different industries in which survivors are crossing paths with us without us perhaps even realizing. And so, for example, in that first image on the left, by the way, I want to mention these images are AI generated because we're very sensitive about not re-exploiting, reusing survivor images without their consent, or at all trying to be as respectful as we can in the education process of this issue, which is admittedly very, very sensitive. And so if the faces look a little funny or something, it's AI, but hopefully they can help us tell the story as well. And so in that first image, that speaks to situations of begging and peddling, where reports have shown that most are women and men, and then we're also seeing instances of children being forced to beg, children from vulnerable families. In situations of, in the second image, the situation of illicit massage businesses, evidence have shown that there are trends in women from their mid-30s to late 50s who are from China or South Korea who are found in those industries to have been trafficked, including, this is also, by the way, a very local issue to Colorado and the Denver metro area. And finally, with the third image, speaking to trafficking in the agriculture sector, traffickers have been known to subject victims to squalid living conditions, often denying them even basic necessities such as beds and indoor toilets. And I wonder if anyone from the audience is familiar, but some of the trafficking cases for which Colorado is infamous, sadly, is cases of trafficking of sheep herders. So individuals brought in on immigrant visas to work on the Western Slope who may not even speak Spanish, they may even speak Quechuan, who are brought in vulnerable on the basis of their immigration status, on the basis of their isolation, on the basis of their language being different from those in their environment. And through those isolated conditions, they have been found to be abused in some of these examples that have been shared in this report. So the sheep herders, the Peruvian sheep herders of Colorado are another example of human trafficking here. I promised to dive into the trafficking profile to help us understand a little better what it looks like. These are slides taken from the Colorado Human Trafficking Council's 101 presentation. And I really encourage you to also reach out to them because they can do a very full and in-depth presentation on trafficking. This is obviously a big and complex issue. There is so much I want to share with you today, and there's still going to be so much more beyond that. And so they're also a great resource to reach out because they can help further the education in this area. But specifically their information around the profiles of traffickers, you could see that in combination with their the Covenant House studies of minor sex trafficking, they've seen that only a small minority of the traffickers were actually strangers, 9%. The majority of traffickers are people that know their victims, that know their vulnerabilities. These could be boyfriends, employers, friends of family, and sometimes immediate family. And in a way, they're the ones that have access to someone who's vulnerable and to understand what their pressure points are and would know how to best threaten, manipulate, groom, and take advantage of that situation. The traffickers' operations also range in complexity from simple, less organized on an individual basis, such as pimps, parents, foreign diplomats, in the case of them abusing their diplomatic immunity to travel with and abuse and exploit their domestic staff and such, to more informal criminal operations such as gangs or extended family that may be engaging in trafficking, to businesses, as we've talked about, businesses in the restaurant industry, in the agriculture industry, and some of these other industries that we've pointed to earlier, massage parlors, all the way up to organized crime syndicates, which is what often tends to be portrayed in the media. And admittedly, I have to share with you, that's how I started in this work. When I first started working on human trafficking, I started working on cases of organized crime from Russia and Ukraine. And that was also my understanding of human trafficking based on how I studied it and what the need was. I was a young lawyer that received a pro bono fellowship with an amazing domestic violence agency in New York called Sanctuary for Families, that through their work have recognized, oh, of course, we serve significant volume of domestic violence individuals, and there's very severe cases of those which are actually trafficking. And so they had a trafficking unit in which I worked. And by virtue of my own background, I was born in Ukraine and I speak Russian, and I was a young female attorney. And so I was thrown into these cases of individuals trafficked from Russia and Ukraine by organized crime. But then in the course of working on these issues, I sure got a lot of lessons fast, most notably from meeting the people themselves, they were so different than what I had in my mind. I was carrying around myths myself, and yet my clients represented, even though they were all trafficked by crime and they were all foreign nationals, I represented men and women. I represented young women and grandmas, people trafficked into sex trafficking, trafficked into stores, trafficked into housekeeping, just so many different situations. And those early experiences, as I mentioned, gave me a lot of lessons and framed what we ended up working on with ALIGHT. I very quickly realized, wow, these individuals, to have any kind of chance of a normal life again, they still have so many effects of their trafficking following them. They need legal help, and they need legal help beyond just immigration needs. They need legal help across a wide array of needs because their lives have been destroyed across all these different dimensions. They need child custody of their children. They need safety. They need to fight in the cases of labor exploitation to be recompensated. They need to address tax fraud. They need to deal with predators after traffickers force them into situations of coerced debt and ruin their credit. Just so many different issues across so many different areas of law. And I also saw that going back to the topic of the trafficker profile, I learned that the traffickers, whether they were individuals or sophisticated organized crime syndicates, they all had a similarity, no matter the level of their operation. They all thought in a way in terms of their victims as things, not people, as their victims as products from which they try to profit as much as possible. And they were constantly thinking about, how can I be more efficient in my profiting from them? How can I get more money out of this person? How can I make them more dependent on me, more hopeless, more trapped? And how can I use technology to be more effective in what I'm doing? And there was just such a huge gap in the level at which the traffickers operated, and then the level at which victim services was trying to catch up. So as I continued my work and started ALIGHT, I wanted to focus on what I did not see being covered, which is legal services, comprehensive legal services, a critical piece of the puzzle that is missing. Again, as I said before, so much needs to come together for that holistic, long, complicated journey to healing, to stability, to recovery that someone needs after the horrors of what they've experienced. So much needs to come together. And we may more immediately think about housing and mental health and food and shelter and things like that, which are certainly incredibly needed resources. But a lot of times we forget that legal resources are also a critical piece of that picture. In fact, legal services are a pathway to holistic services and healing, because those legal barriers that are in those survivors' paths a lot of times don't let them move forward at all, and they just simply must be addressed. Unfortunately, research has borne out that we don't have a lot of legal services available for this population in our country. In 2021, ALIGHT collaborated with a survivor-led organization, the Avery Center, and our fellow co-founders at the National Survivor Law Collective to publish a study. This was a study that the survivor-led research team conducted over a period of months of 550 organizations in the US that are listed as providing legal services for trafficking survivors. And yet, in the course of the study, out of the 550, only 16 organizations could be confirmed as serving this population with meaningful legal representation. As we look at this map on the right panel, compared in our mind to that heat map, knowing that trafficking reports are coming in from all over the country, it's a very sad discrepancy, and especially in this center of the country, you could see that it's ALIGHT's efforts to try to serve survivors in what we in the report have termed a legal desert. Once ALIGHT has started, and this is an effort that a nonprofit that I founded in Denver in 2015, after years of research and development and needs assessment, we launched our pilot program in Denver in 2017. And since then, we've been growing our program and growing our model to be recognized by the American Bar Association as having the model established in Colorado as the way to do pro bono legal services delivery for human trafficking survivors. So this is something that we've been painstakingly growing out to address this problem, to address this lack of services. And very proud to have helped survivors on over 500 cases in over 30 states. Unfortunately, the scale of the problem still is overwhelming. It's much bigger than that, and so we are continuing our work. But our emphasis and our focus with our ALIGHT's work again is comprehensive legal services for this reason, because of this map. This is a missing piece of the conversation and of the services that survivors have available. I have some more slides that dive into some of the dimensions of just how one legal issue, such as a criminal record, impacts survivors. This is a survey of by the National Survivor Network of their members, a significant portion of whom reported having been arrested at least one time. 91% have been arrested. This is also criminal records, and forcing victims to commit crime is also another powerful tool of coercion that traffickers use, that even after they target someone that's vulnerable, they groom them, they trap them in a dynamic where they keep them dependent, then they encourage them or coerce them to commit crimes for which then their victim is left responsible. So the trafficker benefits from the fruit of their crime, whether they force them to commit prostitution or theft or selling drugs or whatever it is. And the trafficker gets off without any liability, and their victim is the one with the criminal records. Having a criminal record, again, makes them more dependent on their trafficker, because criminal records impact, as you can see, housing, employment, and so many other things. Unfortunately, Colorado's laws for record relief garnered us an F in the national state report cards, and you could read more about that. But this is just, again, to remember one legal issue that survivors have among many. Here I want to show some results of who we serve and some of the legal issues that we address at ALIGHT. This is taken from our 2022 impact report. On the right panel, showing how we work on legal issues across over 20 areas of law. You can see criminal records are a significant need for survivors that comes up over and over again. Many have multiple criminal records, perhaps in multiple states, that need to be addressed. We also see significant requests around custody and visitation and divorce and identity change and criminal justice advocacy and some of these others. But yes, issues across the board that survivors need help with. The demographics we serve, again, reinforce our earlier conversation about vulnerability. We are serving individuals, a significant portion of whom, 79% of whom, have self-reported as experiencing homelessness, 23% have experienced the foster care system, and 89% have experienced domestic violence. So again, human trafficking is not really a separate problem. It's unfortunately the problems we already know. It's the challenges we already know, just the hardest cases. The need to address comprehensive legal services has impact beyond just the survivor's welfare and ability to reintegrate, which is incredibly important. Open Door Legal published a white paper that reveal that for every dollar invested in comprehensive legal services, the community receives a benefit of $21. And that is because legal services enable victims to access housing, medical and mental health care, benefits, and other services. Just as we talked about earlier, lifting those barriers, such as criminal records and other pressing needs that survivors have that are emergencies in their lives that if they don't address, they can't move on to the other services and support that they need moving forward. Legal services enable them to, again, be able to generate income and assets, just something that we don't think about because we're not blocked from, but that they, in fact, are being hindered by. And then finally, deterring future illegal conduct. And this is actually future illegal conduct, not just by the traffickers who had exploited them in the first place, but we have to also remember that circle of vulnerability. And we work with so many survivors, some of whom are still in an active trafficking situation, some of whom are on the brink of figuring out whether they can escape and rebuild, some of whom go back and forth to their trafficker, and others who may have been out of trafficking for 20 years and still have legal issues that they're battling. And sometimes it is the traffickers that have created legal problems for their victims, such as the criminal records, as we talked about earlier. And sometimes it is other actors and bad actors that then take advantage of someone's vulnerability. And so we have a number of individuals that are dealing with, payday lenders and creditors after them, or landlords that see that they are alone and have no one on their side to fight for them and try to take advantage of that. And others that are basically perhaps not the traffickers themselves, but are preying on someone's vulnerability that results from the trafficking and keep that cycle going and going and going. And so legal services helps us break that cycle. I want to speak briefly to a couple of concrete situations. We've talked about the relationship between homelessness and trafficking. This is a slide with reference to Denver's first labor trafficking conviction. So we have a link here to a panel that included prosecutors, law enforcement, support services, and I was there representing the legal services, discussing how so many different pieces need to come together for that prosecution to be successful. The survivor, the victim, who was really at the center of it, also needed a lot of support throughout this process. The prosecution lasted for years and years. And beyond that, the trafficker, who was the individual's husband, was also simultaneously creating legal problems in different jurisdictions for the survivor. And so ALIGHT's role was in supporting the survivor. It was at that time 9 different legal cases in 4 jurisdictions, so that she had that professional support from our incredible attorneys in our network, offering over 160 pro bono hours in their services to help her stabilize her life as that prosecution was ongoing, so that she could show up and participate. And finally, also celebrate along with us in the first labor trafficking conviction. Something else that I want to talk about that is referenced in our title is how we've been working on trafficking cases in the context of religious indoctrination. ALIGHT is also active in Utah, working with local partners, where we have seen reports of trafficking in the context of these sort of off-the-grid religious groups, polygamous groups that are very hierarchical, patriarchal, that support the child marriage of girls, that in general devalue children and devalue women. And so boys, the girls are as young as 13, once the elder of the group has a revelation that it is time for them to marry, are married off, often to those who are much more senior in the community. And the boys who have less value, because in a way they're competition for these senior members of the community, are forced to work and earn their keep, and if not, they're streeted and rendered homeless. And so this is an extremely complicated area of human trafficking. We've been going down a rabbit hole because even as we started working on it in Utah, we've been discovering that it's actually taking place all over the country, including in Colorado. So there are reports of these type of cases in Northwest and Southwest Colorado. The dynamics are very, very complicated for this type of trafficking. It is not, it goes beyond even the usual instances where someone is trafficked in a sort of a familial setting, which is also incredibly heartbreaking. But when there's more of a religious, cultural environment, these are people are born into it. Not only their family, but their entire community is normalizing certain abuse and exploitation. And then the religious component to this adds something that very few of us can even understand, which is if you transgress, if you don't marry who I tell you, if you don't listen, if you don't do exactly what I say, you will suffer eternal damnation. So it won't just be shame and dismissal from this community, which is already heartbreaking. If you can imagine, they know no other world, but this would actually stretch out into the future, into all realms. And so it's such a complete form of manipulation. One of the organizations, as I mentioned, one of our partners in Utah is holding out help. They're a local partner, and you could learn more about this dimension of work in a Hulu series that speaks about this intense indoctrination, brainwashing of children that makes it even harder to extricate them from these sort of environments. And I wanted to make sure to briefly reference wage theft, as I know this group was diving into this issue earlier, to emphasize how wage theft, labor exploitation, and labor trafficking, again, are in a spectrum. So you are very familiar with wage theft, and as individuals are denied their earned wages and benefits, and that issue, which is also a very important issue in Colorado, wage theft can become human trafficking, labor trafficking, as you add on those extra elements that we talked about, such as coercion. If someone is also being threatened, if their family is being threatened, if their immigration status is being used as a point of leverage or something else, then that initial crime and denial of wages rises to the level of labor trafficking. And we have an incredible local research coming from Dr. Rebecca Galumbo of University of Denver and her colleagues, specifically around wage theft. So often people ask, oh my gosh, how do we learn more? How do we recognize these signs? So I have some references here for red flags and information for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. If you ever believe that you are witnessing a human trafficking situation, do not get involved. You may be endangering the person there even further. You may be endangering yourself and others. And so call the National Human Trafficking Hotline and they can walk you through other steps and see who else needs to get involved. But do not get involved yourself, but hopefully after this presentation, some new questions are raised for you and you can be more aware and alert about this. I will include a link in the video to one of the survivors that ALIGHT worked with, Jasmine, who did an interview on Denver 7, speaking of all the different legal issues that she still had as she was trying to rebuild her life, what her healing journey entailed, and how ALIGHT was part of that process, helping her gain child custody. So I won't play this now because I think we're sensitive to the time, but you are welcome to watch this. And finally, more information. Oh, it's playing. Pardon me. And finally, our information at ALIGHT. If you are interested to get involved, to make impact, admittedly, this is a very complicated area, but there are very tangible ways to get involved. And so we will be having further events and opportunities to plug into our work, to learn more. So I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter on our website and to also reach out to me. I will pause here. I would be happy to take any questions.
I want to thank you, Marianna. And what I've noticed that's unusual is that we don't have a lot of questions in chat, but I think that was because people were probably listening so closely and carefully to your presentation. So let's take, I think we have one question in chat, and then open it up to people asking questions verbally.
We have one question from Cindy Sestrich, and she wonders if you have any documentation that our broken immigration system laws are not allowing new immigrants a work visa, and this is promoting human trafficking.
Thank you, Cindy. That's a very interesting question. While I started working in the immigration services aspect of trafficking, as I mentioned, I started focusing more on domestic trafficking because of just the lack of services there. ALIGHT serves both domestic and foreign nationals, individuals of all. I should note, our model is intended to be as inclusive as possible, serving foreign nationals and domestic-born victims, individuals of all genders and forms of trafficking. But the legal services that we focus on tend to be those other nuts and bolts services that I discussed in the presentation. There are other really incredible organizations that could speak to this and have a much more updated view that focus on immigration legal services, Colorado Legal Services, and Remain certainly focus on this.
Other questions? Raise your hand and I'll try to acknowledge you. Sally Ogden. How do we unmute people that want to ask questions, Andrew?
I did.
Okay.
I'm, as a retired teacher and one who follows our education issues, recently read an article about the increase in homeschooling that has not gone backwards after COVID. And my concern with homeschooling has always been child abuse. I mean, it just seems like this is a situation ripe for exploitation. And for those who don't know, the rule in Colorado, the legal rule is that parents are supposed to register their child with the local school and take a test every 2 years. If the child does not score above the 13th percentile, they are required to go back to school. Now, I don't know how much people follow through with that, but could you address that situation?
I would also echo your concerns, as in the sense that the further isolation of anyone that's vulnerable, especially vulnerable children, placing them, we've seen that during COVID, farther from others that could witness them, notice what's happening, be a resource as they reach out to help, is certainly troubling. And it goes back to that original framework that we've been talking about, vulnerability. We are concerned about the further isolation, increasing their vulnerability and distancing them from possible resources if they're being abused. And that's one of the hallmarks of trafficking. There are so many people that we don't know about, so many people that don't even know they're victims. It is still an issue that we're trying to wrap our minds around and understand correctly. So those dynamics are being actively discussed in the anti-trafficking community, and thank you for raising it.
Other questions? Terry Kukra.
I work for FEMA, and we're constantly on alert to watch for human trafficking. And I just wondered, can you give us just a few basic ways of identifying the human trafficking? I've taken numbers of courses that talk about them, and I know there's just so many different ways they can take people, but there's a few things you might mention about observing people, say on a bus or on a plane or whatever, that might possibly be that you have a victim and a trafficker. Could you mention just a few of those things to look for?
It's there are many. There are just so many situations of what trafficking can look like. You're essentially looking for a power imbalance of something that looks suspicious. It's there's no clear cut. When we used to think about domestic violence, how long did it take for people to understand that it wasn't just seeing a black eye, right? Or it wasn't just seeing someone physically abused, meaning that domestic violence took place. It's a much more complicated dynamic with elements of power and control that are taking place there. You're watching for a power imbalance in a situation. Is it? My mind is sort of reeling because once you hear stories, you realize they take so many different forms. That it could be someone that doesn't speak the language and is part of a family unit and forced to work all the time, and her husband is the one that does speak English, is the one that's sort of holding all the cards. But it's hard to tell, right? It can be you're going to a public place like carnival or some sort of public event, and you're watching young men leering at girls and coming up and complimenting them. But again, these are not clear-cut cases because it could just be complimenting them, or it could be actually trying to identify who they want to groom. So you have to really look at a lot, and it tends to be a very intensive training. That resource in the presentation that I referenced will hopefully be a start. But you're looking for a power imbalance in a relationship.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's also a number of government, I think it's by FEMA, things on the internet. You could actually take a class, and several of them are helpful. So thought I'd mention that. That was a good answer. It is so complicated. Just watching the power difference between one group and another, or two people, is what we should be alert for. And I think it's good to put it on our phones, the number to call if we see. That way we can just go right there and report what we see. When FEMA has people coming in for the local people that have losses, there's sometimes vans outside, people trying to say, well, we can bring you to a better place where you'll get,
Yes.
and get people that way. But anyway, it's appalling. Thank you.
One of the red flags is, an unstable living situation. It's and what you're seeing, of course, how many people have an unstable living situation, right? So you're taking these as starting points and trying to look deeper.
I just wish more funding was available for helping people. Thank you, by the way. You did a great job. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
There's another question in chat. Bobby, do you want to read that?
Sure. This is coming from Vicki Wilson. Drugs are used as another means of exploitation. The limited opportunities for rehab and recovery programs result in many of these victims ending up in the prison system. Vicky's asking, and she can jump in here about drugs being used to get exploitation.
Absolutely.
That it's basically not a question, it's an observation. And it
Yes.
just, in that cycle that you had illustrated, it seems to me that that's an easy way to draw, especially young women, into the process. I was involved in a program called the Haven that brought women out of the correctional system into recovery. And time and time again, you heard about a boyfriend or some family member connecting these young people into situations that they ordinarily probably would not have gone through if they hadn't first become addicted. And that was pretty much the gateway.
Absolutely. We see that with runaway youth as well, as they're trying to survive. You know, they come maybe to Denver or they're on the streets. There are those that are lurking, and they may initially come in helpful, saying, come, I have a place for you to stay, and then let's party. And it's part of a grooming process, because drug dependency, ensnaring them in their nets, ends up being a much more effective way of having control over them than tying them up, right? That's a very common tool, and thank you for bringing that in.
We have one other quick question from Jeanette Scotland. What happens when one calls the hotline? What is the process?
They will ask what your purpose is, and you may be calling if you're looking for resources for someone, or you may say you want to report a situation, or you may want to ask them, I'm seeing the situation. You know, they may walk you through additional points of question to help advise whether it is worth reporting to law enforcement, but they're a very helpful intermediary in that way.
I'll call on myself. I know you talk about women and men and children, but I would include there also that the LGBTQ plus population is also very vulnerable to various forms of human trafficking, sexual and other forms of human trafficking, in part because, again, of isolation, of power differential, of some of the other things. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and that is also why we're trying to be as inclusive as we can in our model. When I mentioned we work with survivors of all gender, all forms of trafficking, we just know there's so many situations, especially in the case of LGBT youth. You may find sort of compounding vulnerabilities where it's not only youth coming from unstable homes. It may be then they're also running away and trying to survive on the streets. And then on top of that, they're further marginalized in our society. And so these vulnerabilities also layer to make them exponentially more vulnerable to trafficking. And in fact, we know this is a very, very vulnerable population, and their experience, as they seek services, is they don't have the same access to services as a lot of the purpose of speaking about the myths and drawing your attention to how the myths have been framing public consciousness is it's also reflected in a lot of the services that are offered. And so many services are limited, only women or only children. And so then it excludes the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, or only sex trafficking, for example. Thank you. That was a great point. This is a very complicated issue, and I value everyone bringing in really different angles, because every angle actually fits into this into this discussion. So thank you for rounding out the discussion with your questions.
Other comments or questions? Are you aware of legislation that has been brought, that has been passed in other states or other places that has been useful to people who are trying to address the needs of people who are trafficked?
I would start with criminal records, as you've seen, is an overwhelming need that we continue to see, and it's a needless barrier in survivors' path forward. And that state report card that goes state by state, that's a very important, addressing criminal record relief for survivors is a very important issue, and some of our colleagues are advancing it on the federal level.
We have someone saying, could you please show the screen? Oops, I just went off. Could you please show the screen
With the video
the
link.
video link and red flags again?
Sure.
And again, these parts of Marianna's PowerPoints will be on our website within a couple of days.
So these are the red flags and the human trafficking number. And then the next slide has the link to the Denver 7 interview. So I'll keep this one up for now, but
That's great. Any other questions?